Welcome back to another episode of Warren Cali. In this episode, I'm going to detail the story of Little E-Dog from the Rollin 60 Crips. The Rollin 60 Crips are one of the most notorious gangs in Los Angeles and the world in general. The Rollin 60s formed in the 70s and thereon built their name up in the gang world in Los Angeles and later the country. The Rollin 60s became one of the most known Crip gangs from what they did in the streets to media, where several rappers from Los Angeles to other places in the country claiming affiliation to the gang. Little E-Dog was born around 1989 and he would come up in the 60s turf. He came up in a time period where the 60s were in full-fledged wars with gangs like the Hoovers, the Gangsters, and the Inglewood families among others. And growing up in that type of environment, it was easy for Little E-Dog to become accustomed to his surroundings, especially with growing up around several gangsters and numerous of people he looked up to being gang members. And that would be the life that Little E-Dog would embark on. He was ready to put in work and crash out for his gang. By 2008, E-Dog was 18 and a full-fledged member already, having multiple charges in his juvenile years, ranging from things like gun possession, and he would become known for using his gun. That brings us to April 27, 2008. Around 2 a.m., gunshots rang out in the Hoovers turf. A man named Keon was in his apartment where he was staying on Figueroa Street. He got out of his bed and looked out his back window, but he saw nothing. Later that morning, around 6:30 a.m., he discovered a man named Wallace's body on the front steps of the apartment. Wallace had been shot around 6 times. Police had no suspects in Wallace's death until 11 days later when a woman named Ronisha walked into the 77th Street police station and told detectives she had information about a homicide that may have occurred on a porch on Figueroa Street. Ronisha told detectives that 1 or 2 weeks earlier, she was hanging out in an apartment complex where members of the Rollin 60s were. She heard several 60s talking, including Little E-Dog and J Hood among others. They began talking about a murder. Ronisha said E-Dog did most of the talking. Ronisha said E-Dog said to other 60s, we just went over there and we chipped him. E-Dog would go on to say, me, Scooby, J Hood, we was all in the car. Like we was just over there and we chipped him. Chipped him right on the porch, cuz. E-Dog would then go on to say they shot Wallace because he threw up his hood as they was driving through the Hoovers, so they started shooting at him, leading to his death. Ronisha told detectives later that night, around midnight or 1 a.m., E-Dog and several others left the apartment to go back to the scene of the shooting. They returned a couple hours later. Ronisha overheard E-Dog tell J Hood, oh yeah, we passed through there and cuz is still laid out on the porch, like don't nobody know he dead. On the morning of May 1st, 2008, just 4 days after Wallace was killed, 2 men, Derek and Demetrius, stood on the front porch of Derek's home. Derek lived in the A-Tray Gangsters turf. A man approached him wearing a hoodie, and the man drew a gun from his waist. His hoodie then fell off. The man yelled out distance to the A-Tray Gangsters and started shooting at Derek and Demetrius. Demetrius tried to duck behind a wall, but was shot in the back. Derek ran towards the man with the gun and tried to grab the gun, but he was shot in the head. Both Derek and Demetrius survived the shooting, but Demetrius will be paralyzed. Police and prosecutors later asked Demetrius on 4 separate occasions to identify the shooter. On May 13th, 2008, Demetrius was still in the hospital and failed to identify E-Dog from a photo lineup. Much later, on December 21st, 2009, Demetrius later identified E-Dog as a shooter in a live photo lineup at the 77th Street station. Derek identified E-Dog in a photo lineup just 2 weeks after the shooting and said the picture of E-Dog looks like the guy that shot him. Police recovered 3 bullet casings from Wallace's murder scene and 6 from Derek and Demetrius' shooting. Police testified that all the casings were fired from the same gun. Timothy was a member of the 7-4 Hoovers. On February 6, 2009, Timothy and his female friend Quincy were walking Quincy's daughter to school. On their way back home, a white Camaro approached a stop sign and waited as Timothy and Quincy walked towards their car. The driver said to them, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" Timothy replied, "Don't know, do I?" While Timothy talked to the driver, Quincy walked around the back of the car and noticed 2 other people in the passenger and the back seat. As she walked to the middle of the next block, Quincy heard gunshots and heard someone say, "Alright then, Groove." She then dropped to the ground and watched as Timothy ran down the street, getting chased by the Camaro. The front passenger was a dark-skinned black male in his 20s. He held out a gun out the window and shot 5 more times. Quincy lost sight of Timothy as he turned the corner, but she heard more gunshots. Several minutes later, Quincy ran in the area that she saw Timothy and the Camaro turn. Before she could find Timothy, a police officer approached her, and together, they discovered that Timothy was dead in the driveway. A witness named Daniel later gave police a description of the shooter and the car, and the description matched E-Dog. With several people putting Edo to the crimes, he was eventually arrested and charged with the murders of Wallace and the shooting of Derek and Demetrius. On December 30th, 2009, a detective interviewed Tony, the brother of J. Hood, also a member of the Rollin 60 Crips. Tony was in jail by this time and told detectives that on the morning of Timothy's murder, that E-Dog and another Rollin 60 member named Mark picked Tony up in a white Camaro. Mark drove the Camaro, E-Dog sat in the front seat, and Tony sat in the back. Tony said, "We were just driving around, and I didn't even know he had the gun, and then I just seen the boy and the girl crossing the street, then he called them to the car." Tony said the boy told E-Dog, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" But the girl walked behind the car and kept going. E-Dog asked the boy, "What do they call you?" Then he shot. Tony continued by saying E-Dog hopped out and chased him. When we turned the corner, we just see E-Dog chasing that dude running like in the backyards or something, and E-Dog chasing after him. And we heard the shots. Then like that, like bam, then he came back and got in the car. Tony then became scared and thought about what he did. He would say, "If I go to county, man, you know what's going to happen to me up in there? Y'all don't understand. Y'all just want me to tell so y'all can have a case and everything." Eventually, Tony told detectives he did not want to go to jail for a murder that he did not commit. The detective assured Tony she had turned off the recording devices on the table in the interview room, but a video camera continued recording their whole convo. Tony said, "Even though I'm telling the truth, but it's still, I'm paranoid." Tony eventually pled guilty to the murder of Timothy, and he testified at court against E-Dog. At E-Dog's trial regarding his first case, the murder of Wallace, E-Dog would say he didn't remember what he did on April 27, 2008, but he would say he didn't kill Wallace. E-Dog also said that a lot of members of the Rollin 60 gang hung out at the apartment where Ronisha claimed that she overheard E-Dog say he murdered someone. E-Dog also said that Ronisha held a grudge against him because he told others that her hygiene wasn't up to par after they had sex, so she held a grudge against that. Derek and Demetrius from Gangsters Crip, who E-Dog allegedly shot, both took back their statements. Derek took back his statement, saying the police made him choose E-Dog, also stating he was scared to testify because of the street code. Once again, E-Dog would state he didn't know where he was during the shooting of Derek and Demetrius. In E-Dog's case for killing Timothy from Hoover, Daniel, who was a witness, would later recant his statements. He feared for his life and didn't want to testify and didn't want anything to do with the case. E-Dog would say he was hanging out with friends and he never even rode in a white Camaro. He also stated that he didn't shoot Timothy. But even when everyone recanted their statements against E-Dog, he was still found guilty of all charges. For the murders of Timothy and Wallace, E-Dog was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 25 years to life. For the attempted murders of Derek and Demetrius, the court sentenced E-Dog to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, plus an additional 25 years to life on each term, with gang enhancement and firearm enhancements. So E-Dog got thrown a book with multiple life sentences and 130 years additional. E-Dog still pleads his innocence, especially with all the statements being recanted against him in trial. E-Dog is now 35 and in Calipatria State Prison, which he will most likely never leave. This will conclude this episode. If you haven't already, check out my previous episodes. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.